So my name is Moira Godfrey, and at the time that I was doing this research as part of the MSc, I was working in a local authority social work department, and I was in a learning and development role. And as part of that, I was delivering the MBLC programme to our staff and to some of our social work students. These were guys that were employed by the local authority. And this was really close to my heart, because if we go back to 2002 maybe, I was a frontline social worker myself, and it all went a bit wrong really. I've grown my hair since then. I was stressed, I was depressed, I was off work, I was fast-headed for burnout. I was 5 years into the profession as a qualified worker. And yeah. And as part of my kind of getting well, getting back to work, looking after myself, I stumbled into this place. And I stumbled into Rob Nairn, not literally, but I stumbled into Rob Nairn. And I think Choden said last night about those initial meetings with Rob Nairn that kind of change your entire trajectory of your life, and certainly that was for me. So it was great to be able to kind of start to share some of this with my colleagues, with my peers, because I knew they also suffer from stress. I know they were also suffering in the job. And when I looked at the literature, it said the same thing. We weren't alone in this. You know, the literature is very clear about the toll that the work was taking on the profession, the turnover, the people leaving, choosing to leave the profession. So, I wanted to know, how were the people that were in my organisation, how were they experiencing MBLC? So this was a mixed methods design. I looked at 3 different cohorts. 2 of these were social work staff and support staff, and 1 was a smaller group of social work students. And I got them to do questionnaires before the course, then again at the end, and I was looking at stress and I was looking at self-compassion. And then this fed into the next bit, because that was all really interesting, being able to measure and see those results, but I was really interested to hear what they had to say. What were the stories? What was their experience of this? So in the second phase, I interviewed 6 of the people. It's really interesting actually. At the cohort, there was 31 people. They were all female apart from 1 guy. And he wouldn't be interviewed. Anyway. So semi-structured interviews with these 6 people after I'd looked at the quantitative data and saw what that had to say. I have to share with you actually, I missed or perhaps ignored the fact that we were told to have 5 slides for this, so I handed in 10. And Heather edited these for me, so she's removed all the slides with my data. But I was so delighted that she kept the Teletubby. Good choice. So I'll tell you about my data instead, and if all else fails, we can just look at the Teletubby. But what happened in the quantitative phase, the results that were coming back showed huge changes for these people. 33% changes in the amounts of stress pre and post test. And it was really clear that before they started the course, their stress levels were really high. So the PSS talks about maybe 11 or 12 being a kind of normal stress level for their particular age and demographic. These guys were way up there. These guys were way up between sort of 18, 19, 20, up to 30, really high stress levels. After the course, these all dropped down into the normal range. And so a third, 33% drop, and an even bigger percentage drop for the guys that started out in the highest levels of stress. And the self-compassion scale, the same thing. Big changes across all of the subscales. And interestingly, particularly the self-kindness, for common humanity, and for over-identification. And this was particularly interesting for me because that was one of the elements that kept coming up in the literature about what causes social workers to get stressed. 30 participants, pinch of salt, I realise, with quantitative data, but but these were all highly significant changes. So I then wanted to know, what were the stories, what were their own experiences, what were they saying about how this had changed things for them? They all talked about how stressed they were to begin with. They all talked about maybe thinking about leaving the profession, or the impact it was having on their personal lives. They talked about improved sleep. They talked about being better able to be present with the people that we work with, to have empathy for them. They talked about better focus, better concentration. And most interesting for me were these ones here. More self-awareness, more self-compassion, that shift in perspective and more emotional regulation. Because these were the messages that I was reading in the literature. These are the characteristics that contributed to resilience. When, in the literature, people who'd kind of survived and thrived in the profession had a chance to talk about how they survived, why they thrived, these were the factors that kept coming up. So here are these guys telling me that MBLC contributed to these. They talked about being more self-aware. They talked about recognising when they were starting to get stressed, the physicality of that, the tension, the tightness, the speeding up of their speech, the moving through the world slightly more fast and noticing that and using that as a sign to slow down, to take a lunch break. They talked about being more aware of how they felt in the midst of working with somebody, noticing their own emotions, being more aware of how that was impacting on others. They talked about a shift in perspective. They talked about we forget that we're human too, which went on to be my title, that I'm not here to fix things, that that's not my job, that's not my role, and that's not something I can do, but recognising that that sometimes became all-consuming. And they were able to take a step back from that. And they talked overwhelmingly about self-compassion. They talked about light bulb moments and transformations and revelations. They talked about, tearfully, it's okay to look after myself. They talked about being able to actually stop and look after themselves. So, pinch of salt. But MBLC, certainly for this group, for this cohort, was associated with really big drops in stress levels, significant decreases in people's experiences of stress, and significant increases in self-compassion. And for me, most interestingly, that participation in the MBLC programme seem to contribute to some of these key characteristics that come from the literature about what contributes to resilience in social workers. Self-awareness, that balanced perspective about role, and a bit of self-compassion and self-care and kindness. And the MBLC, these guys were telling me, had given them some of that. And as I said, the message from the literature is that if we can have these sorts of characteristics, these sorts of qualities, if we can facilitate them and support them, we're more likely to be able to survive in a profession and to thrive in the profession. And that's all I've got.